rising coaches. I appreciate this opportunity to be with you. I'll be honest with you. This is a little overwhelming. So many things have just in the short time that we've been together have really crossed my mind, and I want to hear a lot of the things that other guys have to say about the things that they're doing with their team and so forth. But I do think that this is a problem that needs a lot of perspective, and there is a historical context to this, and I want to kind of just jump into that. Racism in this country is not new. The issue that we're talking about today is a 400-year problem in the making, and so much of what we're talking about when we talk about systematic racism, I'd like to use another term, institutional racism. I saw something, I was looking at something about George Washington as a slave holder. That was the term that was used. Well, the truth of the matter was, he wasn't a slave holder, he was a slave owner. And George Washington is neither here nor there to the conversation, but I think the words that we use are really, really significant. And the intent of this systematic racism is really something that we got to dig deep into and get to the root of the issue, or it grows back. And so one of the things that comes to mind for me, when you look at the history of racism in this country, whether it's Jews, Catholics, Irish, Polish, Italians, so many ethnicities have been discriminated against. The two significant differences between Black folks and those others are, one, the obvious, that we're readily identifiable by our skin color. And so it becomes easy to mark a person when you can identify them so easily. The second thing is that those ethnicities have had an opportunity to rise out of this racism in so many respects. Yeah, maybe they could be identified by their last name, maybe by their zip code or neighborhood. But the reality was, for all of those groups, they were able to own land. They were able to own property. When you go back and you look at the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the cities where those communities were developed for those ethnicities, it was about being able to own your own house, own your own tenement, live upstairs, and open your business downstairs. Black folks have been denied that one opportunity, ownership. This systematic racism that we're dealing with can only change through ownership. And there's a burden to be shared, a burden that Black folks have carried for 400 years. And the fact of the matter remains is the people that have the most lose are the ones that have to carry the burden. It's the people that have something that they have to give up for others to rise up. I think a lot of what we're going to be discussing and talking about is what I would call this survival versus thrive, survivor versus thriver syndrome is what I call it. So many of the kids that we're coaching are in this survival mode, so they're just going to try to get it done however they can. But to thrive, you have to have a foundation, and we need our kids to be in a situation where they're on a level playing field, where the court is 94 feet long, the baskets are 10 foot high, and they have a fair chance to compete. The rules are the same for everybody. And that's what we're missing. But that cannot be achieved without ownership. So to talk about ownership in the context of college athletics is a challenging thing. We have to figure out and be able to define what ownership is. We have to figure out ways that we can create equity and fairness. Everything's not going to be equal. Everything's not going to be the same, but it does have to be fair. And what we're talking about are opportunities for people. And I'll just kind of close with one other thought. I wrote a piece a number of years back, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, the real key for us is to educate our kids on our college campuses. We're doing a lot in terms of helping kids get degrees, but we're not providing them with the type of education that prepares them for life, that prepares them for ownership. One or two simple examples that I would give is the basic finance that a lot of black kids lack when they come to college and when they leave college is basic finance. Knowing about credit, knowing how to get credit and attain credit and what that means over the course of your lifetime, knowing about finances, knowing about investments and things of that nature. And it's easy to say, well, they should get those things. But if we don't provide that, if we don't set the table for them, then it's going to be really hard for kids to really understand that. I'll give you one last example. Relationships, college level material, male-female relationships, teacher-student relationships, employee-employer relationships. These are the things that kids on our campus should be learning about. For every single one of us, there's probably somebody on our team that is overpowering in stature, intimidating in a classroom setting, an 18, 19-year-old kid that comes in the classroom that is intimidating to that professor, intimidating to that student to the left and to the right, and all our behavior and all the things that we teach are about aggression and authority and a presence. And that's what people see. But for those kids, when they look in the mirror, that's what they see is an 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old kid. And so there's this major disconnect with how these kids perceive themselves, the power that they wield, and the ability to use that in a way that allows the campus community to come together, frankly. And we certainly can make that same argument that those kids are going to be the same threat walking across campus at dusk or at night, walking to and from the dorms. And we can go on and on. But those would be just some of my opening thoughts. And again, I want to thank you guys for this opportunity to be a part of this.
I think for me, when I think about this issue, I've always thought about like, where can I impact the most change? And so because like I'm going to be in the media space, one of the things I've realized over the last couple of weeks is just, and I should have realized it before, is just how important it is to amplify Black voices, whether that's in sports or just in life. And I think for a long time, I thought, and a lot of other white people thought, that like just being neutral and making sure that people weren't being racist or like overt, like explicitly racist was good enough. And I think over the last month or two, everything that I've read and heard and seen makes me realize that like there's a distinct perspective that Black people bring to the conversation in everything. And so to me, it's just vitally important that white people in the media help amplify those Black voices, and that they give those people opportunities in media, or just, a platform in any possible way. I think that can be in terms of really any context. In basketball, I think, making sure the players have a voice so people better understand what college athletes go through and empower them, where, during coronavirus, for instance, like these kids go home, I go home to, I have no issue, right? Like I go home and I'm tweeting from my couch and everything feels pretty normal, but there are so many people who weren't having things be normal, and they had to take a job to pay bills for their family. And so I think when media members don't tell that story too, we miss the real story of these people, because we're not telling stories just about basketball. We're telling stories about people who play basketball, but they're more than just basketball players. So I think for me, just looking forward, trying to figure out ways that we can, further amplify these voices and try to spark a larger conversation, because I think it's become clear to me that we can't just go back to like hopping on podcasts and writing stories just about kids based on the context of how they play basketball, or coaches based on, how they coach basketball, because there's so much more behind all these great people. Yeah, I think for me, what's interesting is I think I'm probably the youngest guy of the speakers on the panel, and Coach Wilson, you might be the elder statesman of the group. So I just wanted to know kind of your perspective on, do you ever feel like there's been a moment in your life where there's been such widespread conversation, and if so, and it fell off, how do we change that from happening this time? How do we keep the dialogue moving forward? Not next month, but next year, next 5 years, next 10 years.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think back to even before I was born, the dialogue that we're talking about right now, especially as it relates to sports, Jackie Robinson integrating baseball in 1947 is the first thing that comes to mind. I played college basketball, started my career in the late 70s, and it was a time of integration. I was the fourth black basketball player to finish my eligibility and graduate from Rice University in 1982. And so it really, some of these things weren't that long ago. And there wasn't much dialogue about those things. The most significant dialogue relative to race that I can remember would have been late 80s, early 90s, the discussion about Prop 48, Prop 42, which raised the academic standards and essentially eliminated a whole group of black athletes that had previously had the opportunity to go to Division I schools. And so when you think about it in those terms, the late 80s, early 90s, and you go backward to the early 80s, late 70s, that was just a period of integration. And you fast forward 10 short years, and then all of a sudden there was a whole group of athletes that was being eliminated from the pool. I remember in 1992, all the black head coaches, and it was my first year as a head coach. We met in Chicago and had a meeting to discuss the things that we can do. And I think a lot of people may remember, I don't know if many on this call would remember, but John Thompson probably was the most significant figure in the room that day. And he walked out in protest, walked out of a game. He was one of the few guys, especially black coaches at that time, because there weren't very many, certainly fewer than there are today. But he was the one guy that walked out of the room, out of the game, actually, in protest to bring attention to what was going on. And the whole argument there was that, we had to give kids opportunities, whether they were prepared or not. At some point during their college tenure, they would be a part of a captive audience, and we had the opportunity to get kids up to speed. It wasn't always because they weren't prepared or didn't have the intellect, but just didn't have the opportunity and the resources. And so I think the big difference, though, as I see today, is that there really is an interest on both sides for the first time to have a dialogue, to have an understanding. I've been amazed. I've been really proud of some of my colleagues and friends who are white that have shown humility and talked about things in a way that we haven't. I'm talking about people that I've known for 35 years, 40 years, to be able to open up and have a very specific dialogue, not just about what I feel as a black man, but what they feel as a white man, and things that they've been naive to. And I think that has been that's been a revelation, I think, on all sides. And so I think that in itself will help keep this thing going. The fact that people are, for the first time, being honest and having a dialogue about race from both sides. And certainly forums like this, the educational piece, just talking about different things, sharing ideas, is the thing that makes the most difference. Kevin, I want to throw it back to you if I can. And being a young guy, as you are, and a writer, I am curious about your perspective on the disconnect between white college coaches, head coaches who get the second and third opportunity, where black head coaches can barely get the first opportunity, let alone the assistant coaches that don't get opportunities. Can you talk about that and give your perspective and thoughts on that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a number of things. One of the things I think is very frustrating is like there's an idea, whether it's conscious or not, that I think sometimes like the burden of proof's on the black coach to prove that they can coach, or then to prove that they are as qualified, even though the resumes speak for themselves. I think another thing is just guys getting put into boxes. Like I remember listening to Brandon Goebel's podcast when he had Penny Collins and Tubby Smith on, and Penny said, talked about how media members will label a guy as just the recruiter. Like they'll write the story about the assistant coach, and it won't, when they talk about the black assistant coach, they won't write a feature about how he drew up a great game plan for a big win, or was the guy who drew up the final play. But instead they write about the kid that they landed on the recruiting trail. And so that just perpetuates a stereotype that's already there and already rolling along. And so I think, from a media lens, the biggest thing like we can do is sometimes I'll forget that what I tweet out there just like innocently as a thought is something that other coaches are going to see, ADs are going to see. And those things, you never know what tweet, what article will turn into something that sparks interest of an AD to put on a list for the next time he's looking to make a coaching hire. So I think, in the media, one of the things that I can do is just try to amplify some of those voices and get guys on podcasts and write stories about people and make sure that when I get a coach on a podcast, I'm not closing them into a box. I'm giving them the opportunity to share all the knowledge that they have. And I think if we do that, we'll be in better shape. I think as long as there's so many more white ADs and white presidents, it's going to be very challenging. And so I think that's certainly a massive implicator for this, is getting people into higher education, black people into higher education. But just from a media lens, I think just making sure that we're portraying, these coaches in a way that accurately represents what their abilities are would go a long way.